I want to go back, because I think a lot was said by Cindy, and no criticism of anything, but I think it had a slant to it. It had aspects to it which need to be really looked at. I want to go back and read you Amendment Article 5. I want to read it to you very closely, because you need to understand a few things. Now, up front, I think something has to be done with respect to our government. I'm not arguing that we don't have to do something with respect to our government. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't make an effort. But I'm arguing this idea of constitutional states is somewhat less than perfectly orchestrated. Article 5, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of legislators of 2/3 of the states, call a convention for proposing amendments. It's not the license of the states to say what an Article 5 convention shall be like. There is nothing in this language to tell you that. If you go look at Article 1, Section 8, Clause, turn your book over there. The last clause, 18, necessary and proper clause. Congress will use the necessary and proper clause because the necessary and proper clause relates back to everything they have a right to and they control. And if you don't think Congress is going to take a voice, and what is a convention, then you're being naive. The second part of this thing was to give you the idea of how much weight the Congress holds on this. I'm not supporting Congress, but I'm telling you, you have to be realistic and read these things. Because it says, in which case shall be valid for the all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by convention of 3/4 thereof, as one or the other modes of ratification may be proposed by Congress. Yes, you have two ways to ratify, but Congress will propose the way in which the ratification takes place. So Congress has one heck of a weighty voice in describing any of this. And yes, they must call a convention, but there's nothing in here that says they can't describe that convention. There's nothing in here that says they can't tell the rules of that convention. There's nothing in here that allows the states to dictate to the Congress how Congress shall call the convention. In all honesty, if there is one article in our Constitution that has a lot of ambiguity in it, it's Article 5. Now I want to talk about a Constitution of states because there is nothing in our Congress and our Constitution that talks about a convention of states. It talks about a convention, no more. It's left to the imaginations of those in Congress and anyone who wants to argue the point as to what is the definition of a convention. Madison, author of our Constitution for the most part, and our first 10 amendments. September the 10th, not the 15th, is when this first came up in majority argument within the Philadelphia Convention, because it was then that Article 5 came up for discussion. And yes, James Madison raised the issue as to the possibility of only Congress being able to look at changing the Constitution, and he objected to that. On September the 10th, he expressed his concern as to what it meant to be a convention. And the words he used on that day was, call a convention for the purpose, as sufficient reason for reconsidering the Article 5. How was a convention to be formed? By what rules to decide it? And what force of its acts? It was on September the 15th when they went into discussion of what was Article 5 at that point, that they tabled that form of Article 5. Hamilton introduced another version. which Madison had been working with, and they took it upon and they laid the one that was aside, and the one they placed on the table did not have the word convention in it, period. Because at that time, Madison saw no purpose of a convention. He felt like, right or wrong, that either the states could come forth with their call for an amendment, or the Congress could, but the Congress could take it up with themselves. It was that wording that was put into place, and then the word convention put back in it, that became what we have as in Article 5. Now I want to talk about the Convention of States. I don't know how many people of you in here know the name Joseph Story. I'm sure one of us do. He's a judge. He was on the Supreme Court. He worked for Madison. Joseph Story wrote 3 books, 3 volumes, on the background of this country, its formation, our revolution, and the treatment of the Constitution. And what I found in there, and I've read a lot of the stuff myself, was that Joseph's story included the following. On the 21st of February, 1787, a resolution was accordingly moved and carried in Congress. Now, this is not the Congress of today, it's the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, recommending a convention to meet in Philadelphia on the second Monday of May ensuing, for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several state legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as shall, when agreed to in Congress and confirmed by the states, render the federal Constitution adequate to the exigencies of government and preservation of the Union. Because the argument is made by Dr. Ferris that it's an entire radical thing to say that the purpose wasn't to amend the Articles of Confederation. But those words lie right within the annals of Congress. The purpose was to try to find a way to make our nation survive. It was not surviving under the Articles of Confederation, because under the Articles of Confederation, that which we called our federal government had no power of any extent. The power, absolute sovereignty, for each state resided with the state. They were still 13 states, and if the national government needed anything, it'd come askance to those states for money or anything else. That is when they met following the Annapolis Convention, in which they said something's got to be done, because we're having a heck of a problem here between Maryland and Virginia on our borders, our common borders called the Potomac River, and our fisheries and things. We've got to get together and give some kind of voice to a level of government above us, each of the states, which can look upon us and be a mediator and make sure that we're working together, not falling apart. And that was what generated the Philadelphia Convention, was that the Articles of Confederation were too bloody weak, and they needed revision. Now, I'm not really bothered. God, I feel blessed with what happened when they came out of it, and then they didn't revise the Articles of Confederation. They changed the entire bloody thing and gave us a new Constitution. It just happened that the people at that time were a heck of a lot ingenious. They were a heck of a lot in common knowledge. They had a set of values of unbelievable taste, and they gave us a convention, a constitution. They gave us a dual republic. They gave us a nation that could be bonded together and work together. The reason it was called, and they talked about it, and I agree, George Washington even said something to his little adopted son Lafayette in a letter about the Constitution of States, is that you got to realize, when Congress asked for this convention, they didn't call it a convention of states. They said a convention. But the states had within its own sovereignty, each the states had within their sovereignty to say how it was going to be at that time. there was no Article 6 as we have today in our Constitution. There was no Article 6 in the Articles of Confederation. Do any of you know what Article 6 is? Article 6 is a supremacy clause, which says the Constitution, the laws therefrom within, and the treaties are the supreme law of the land. They are supreme to state law. It's set, therefore, the states in obedience to the laws of the federal government, as opposed to the way it was under the Articles of Confederation, in which there were no laws formed by the national government. The states had absolute sovereignty, so they could call it a convention of states. And they called it a convention of states when they talked to one another. But if you now go back and look at the ratification conventions, Virginia, when Patrick Henry said, dudes, I'm not happy with what's going on with this Constitution we've formed, I want to do some more work on it. I want a second convention. He wanted a federal convention. The same thing happened in New York. And when in New York they wanted a second convention, and believe me, Madison was scared as the devil of any kind of second convention because he knew what they were going to do. They were going to undo the Constitution, or at least that's what he thought. And I think he had a pretty good idea going in his mind. He was correct. They were going to change it. They did not like the idea that a Constitution had been formed with a federal government that had that much voice. They wanted to change it and put it back more as a compromise between an Articles of Confederation and this Constitution that had been formed. In New York, they wanted to have a national convention. Why on God's green earth they wanted to call it a national convention, I don't know, because one of the first things they had to decide when they had the Philadelphia Convention was, are we going to have a federal government, a republic, or are we going to have a national government? Do you understand what a national government is? It took away all voice of states, identity of states. They considered that. Hamilton would have loved to have something that looked like the English government, with a parliament and a king, etc. We began our formation of our Constitution in what was called the Virginia Plan. Now, the advocates of the Constitution of States, and believe me, I'm not trying to tell you you shouldn't look at being able to have a check on your federal government. God knows it's out of control. But you've got to do it in a way that doesn't lead to more disorder. Because when Franklin walked out that day, and the lady asked him, what did you give us? He said, a republic, if you can keep it. Do you know that Franklin, Adams, Madison, all said about the same thing? In order for us to have and keep our republic, as this government is formed under the Constitution, we must have morals and values. Folks, we didn't get here because we don't have enough control. We got here because we have about 435 brilliant people up in the Congress have figured devious ways to get around things. Now the problem is when you start to have a convention of states and you're going to have a general area, you're going to try to do something to control what this government is doing. You going to keep time on me, by the way? Thank you, sir. Then what we're saying is we're going to have a convention and we're going to do a bunch of amendments because the government's out of control. Folks, you have just put a group of people in a room is the same dang gone way you did up in Philadelphia, and you said, revise it. Whether it's additions to the Constitution that we have or something else, I don't know. But it's not just a party of people here who want this particular convention of states. It's also the progressives who would love to have a convention of states. Conservatives are not the only voice or portions of it screaming for a convention. The thing is, In order to have a convention of states, the Congress is going to have to let it happen. They can devise a convention in any way they want. Read Article 5. Am I afraid of a runaway convention? You darn tootin' I am. Because I'm no more impressed with the people down in Richmond than I am with the people in D.C. I don't see any brilliance down there that exceeds what's in Washington. And so I don't see a company of people coming together. I don't care whether it's 2 per state, 10 per state, or what. And put them in a room and tell me that you're going to form a group of amendments and that, oh geez, I got a checkpoint here because it needs 38 states to ratify it. Folks, I'm going to remind you, do you know what the 16th Amendment is? Do you know what the 17th Amendment is? Do you know what the 18th Amendment is? Taxes. Took the Senate out of the hands and took away a balance of voice between states and federal government and put it in the hands of a popular vote, instead of letting the state legislatures continue to appoint who they wanted to represent the state and Congress. And then we have that other one, prohibition. And if you don't think people can get up in arms and run away with silly ideas, look at that one. Okay? That's the only one that was ever rescinded. Had another amendment to neutralize it. It was done by yellow journalism, if you will, is what it was called in those days. A group of publishers wanted to press it, and they did. And they got people stirred up. People didn't want to drink. Fine, if you don't want to drink, that's your business. If you want to drink, that's your business too. That's what this nation is, freedom. You want to kill yourself, kill yourself. But we had a prohibition law. Folks, we have 27 amendments. The first 10 we know and cherish. The other 17 come along, and the last one said we aren't going to pay those bloody buggers up in Congress any more than a certain amount, is basically what it amounted to. But you got 27 amendments in the history of this nation to our Constitution. No, I don't want to have a group of people sitting in a room saying, I've got a general problem with Congress, and I'm going to put all these amendments together so I can control it, because you're not going to control them. You want to have a balanced budget amendment? I'm going to tell you that the balanced budget amendment would have had to somehow do away with the Fed. How many years did Ron Paul spend of his lifetime trying to get Congress to take a look at the Fed? Did they? No. Congress is not going to do that. Yet, if you want to balance the budget, you're going to have to somehow have that voice of controlling the Fed. You want to talk about borrowing money and lending money? I was a kid at the time. I was about 1 or 2 years old. I'm dating myself. Roosevelt had the Lend-Lease agreement. He lent all sorts of stuff to foreign countries and in return leased property. There's and the nation, you've got to understand, did not want to get involved in the World War II. They wanted to leave the bloody mess of Europe over in Europe, because they had enough problems, they lost enough of the lives in World War I. They didn't want to get involved in it. So Roosevelt used that as a way of getting around it. All I'm trying to tell you is there is nothing beyond the ingenuity and genius of people to find ways to turn the words. And if you don't believe there isn't genius in turning the words, go look at the way they've interpreted our Constitution to date. And they started that in the early 1800s. I wish I had time to read you some of the most precious things that were said of interpretation of the Constitution, even beginning in the early 1800s. Now, folks argue that there's precedence for Convention of States. Folks, there's no precedent for a Convention of States to amend the Constitution of the United States. Only one. The Philadelphia Convention, which was a convention of states, commissioners from states gathered. And they closed the doors, closed the windows, pulled the shades, drew the blinds, turned on the candles, and went about their business of rewriting a constitution. I'm happy they did. We don't have Madisons today. We don't have Adams of today. We don't have George Washingtons of today. Frankly, we don't have that caliber of people. We've got a bunch of devious people in our Congress. And you don't think they'll take, you can write them until you are blue in the face, and they will find ways to get around them. So you say, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to tell you what the disposition of the state of Virginia was in this last General Assembly. There were 4 or 5 amendment bills put in the state legislature this year for regarding amendments to the Constitution. The Convention of States failed in the House. The vote was 29 for it and 67 against it. I spent a lot of time down there talking to those folks about this. Spent a lot of emails, a lot of time on the phones, a lot of face-to-face. There was an amendment there was a proposed thing to amend the Constitution or change things so that we could control what the delegates did. How do you control how a person's going to vote on something when you don't know what they're going to vote on until they get into convention and to decide what the amendments are going to be? You can't tell somebody how to vote on an amendment that doesn't even exist at that time when you send them up there to this convention of states. But that's what that bill wanted to do. It wanted to say, you can't go in there and do such and such and such and such. Well, they didn't even know what they were going. When they said you can't do such and such, it was like, gee, you're going to hold this convention of states. We don't know what amendments you're going to talk about. We don't know how you're going to solve it, but we're going to tell you how to talk about it. It's sort of like the Russian government that had to send them all back to their respective states and be told how to act once they knew what they were acting upon. That bill failed 40 to 59. The balanced budget amendment has been 4 years roughly now coming in before the General Assembly. This year it failed 45 to 54. There was only one measure regarding an amendment proposition that passed. And I'm a little proud of it because it had devious intentions in writing it, and I am very proud of it, in fact. Delegate Landis put it in. And it was an amendment to Article 5. It was an amendment to very carefully control how the process would take place, what you could do to amend our Constitution. With your permission, if I have time, I'd like to read it. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the applications of legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, for one and no more than one identical amendment shall call an amendment convention of the states. If no other amendment convention exists at the time. In other words, you can't look at it one amendment at a time. Control the rate of change. Consisting of 2 delegate seats per each state to be filled by the respective state legislatures and being committed to consider only that identical amendment and no more for submission to the states for ratification. In other words, you could only look at one amendment at a time, and all the states had to agree on what that amendment was to begin with. It was to put careful, dedicated control on how much you can change our Constitution. Folks, there's nothing wrong with our Constitution. It's the people up in D.C. And it's us. It's our states. The federal government only has as much power as it's taken because we, the people, and we, the states, have allowed it to happen. We see the states and the people stand up and say, we have Article 10, we have Article 10, we've only given you, the federal government, just so much responsibility, and we got all the rest, we have the rights of the rest. Every time we take money from them for education, for transportation, or anything else from the federal government, we have just designated the federal government the power in that area. We're doing it to ourselves. If we did not take the money from them in the first place, they couldn't tell us what to do. And that I offer you is a heck of a lot stronger a way to go about it. Nullification. We're nullifying our Constitution like crazy every time we take money. We just nullified Article 10 by taking the money and giving the federal government a voice. We basically we've done away with the authority of it by taking that money. Madison did not call it nullification, he called it interposition. I've talked to a number of the legislators and said, what guys, if you didn't try to butt heads as a state government against the federal government, but instead let the people themselves decide a matter? What do I call it? Because I keep forgetting it.
Abrogation.
No, not abrogation, but when you, a referendum. Let the people vote on something. I've seen 4 referendums in this country. In Oklahoma, Missouri, and Utah. And which states have voted on something, and the federal government hasn't done a bloody thing against it because it was a vote against the federal government by the people. It's harder for the federal government, when you really come down to it, to fight the people, no matter what you think about it. If you stand together, you work together, you can exist together. You don't do anything, you're going to die, surely. Something says about, united we stand, divided we fall. But Madison would have given you the thing of these are the positions of the people, and the state government shall interpose on behalf of the people. They talk about that in the Federalist Papers in several places. Either the federal government will protect the people from the state government, or the state government will protect the people from the federal government. One of the two. So enlist the state governments. Don't take money. Go through a referendum process and let the state government protect us. Have I run out of time?
You have 3 minutes and 26 seconds.
I have 3 minutes and 26 seconds. I frankly don't have any more to say, because what I'm trying to say to you is, you don't assume you can have a convention of states. The Congress is going to decide that. I've talked to enough congressmen to know that even if you come up with certain ideas, they're probably going to pick up the ball and run with it and do something themselves before it ever gets to a point of a convention. I've heard those statements made by a lot of them one-on-one from a number of different states. They're going to use Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. They're also going to use Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. Look at real fast. Because that says you can't have a compact between states unless the Congress approves it. And if the states get together and draw up all these things they're going to do, such as we're going to decide to have a convention of states, folks, that's a compact. You can have your Constitution. You're going to have parts of it you're going to have to follow that you don't like. But I'm not willing to be a conservative and disregard the strict adherence and obedience to my Constitution, disregard it in the way liberals do. I may hurt in the process, but I believe in my Constitution. I believe it's my responsibility to support it, to die for it. I have no children to die for it for. I just have my beliefs. And until you find a legitimate way to say you can have a convention of states, you're not going to have it. Only if the Congress is willing to let you have it. But to say you can have it right now, or to say that it's there, this edict, etc., or even that the courts approve it, which I find is an extremely interesting idea, that we would lean upon interpretation of the courts as to whether or not we can have a convention of states, when one of the things we're objecting to is the state, the courts, taking the legislative voice away from Congress and legislating decisions. And in that case, you look at Article 5, only the Congress is mentioned. The judges aren't. The president isn't. So if you let the judicial branch decide what constitutes or what is a convention, then you've just said that the courts can decide. They're not mentioned in Article 5 as having a voice, but the Congress can't decide, but the Congress is the one in Article 5 that's given the voice. You've just disregarded Article 5 entirely. Thank you.